like, and make sure to engage in comments. Also share this video to your friends and story lovers and click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Mortifex for more real horror stories like this. You never expect your life to stop in an instant. One moment, you're living it, breathing it, and the next, it's gone, frozen in some in-between place. That's how it felt for Jeremy. He was a young guy, 26, full of life, chasing the dream like everyone else in Los Angeles. He'd never imagined he'd wake up to find out the world had moved on without him. When his eyes blinked open, everything felt off. The sterile smell of antiseptic, the beeping of machines, and the rough, dry air of the hospital room. It all hit him at once. But what hit him harder was the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence you expect in a hospital, where nurses chatter and carts squeak down hallways. No, this was oppressive. Jeremy sat up, his head spinning from the effort. He noticed his arms were thinner, his legs weaker, his body barely his own. He didn't need to be told he'd been out for a while. The calendar on the wall was from 6 months ago, the pages yellowed and curling at the edges. He grabbed the call button by the bed and pressed it. Nothing. He pressed it again, harder this time, but the red light didn't blink, and no footsteps came rushing down the hall. Panic crept into his chest. He yanked the IV out of his arm and swung his legs over the edge of the bed. His feet touched the cold tile floor, and that's when he noticed it. The faint smell of smoke. The air tasted different, metallic and heavy. Jeremy limped toward the window, his muscles protesting with every step. Outside, the world was a hazy orange. Smoke curled in the distance, blotting out the sun. He didn't understand at first. California fires? His brain whispered, but it didn't connect. He turned back to the room and saw his reflection in a small mirror on the wall. His face was gaunt, his cheeks hollow, and his hair had grown longer than he'd ever let it get. That's when the dread hit him. How long had he been here? He stumbled out into the hallway, gripping the door frame for balance. The corridor was empty, eerily so. Beds were pushed to the side, as if someone had hurriedly cleared the way. A gurney lay tipped over, its wheels spinning slowly, squeaking like a ghostly metronome. Jeremy called out, his voice cracking. "Hello? Is anyone here?" His words echoed back at him, bouncing off the walls like a cruel joke. Then he heard it. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of children crying. Jeremy froze. It was soft at first, almost like a trick of the mind. But as he strained his ears, it became clearer, more desperate. The cries weren't coming from outside. They were here, somewhere in the building. He followed the sound, his bare feet slapping against the cold floor. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of fear pressing down on him. As he moved further down the hallway, the smoke grew thicker, the air harder to breathe. Doors hung open, revealing rooms that looked like they'd been abandoned in a hurry. IV stands were toppled over, papers scattered everywhere, and the faint scorch marks on the walls told a story of panic and chaos. But it wasn't just the emptiness that unnerved him. It was the feeling of being watched. He glanced over his shoulder more than once, certain he'd see someone, or something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. Only the flickering of dying fluorescent lights overhead. The crying grew louder, leading him to a stairwell. The door was heavy, metal, and when he pushed it open, the hinges groaned like they hadn't been moved in years. He peered down the dark staircase, the cries now echoing from below. "Is anyone there?" he called out, his voice trembling. No response, just more crying. Jeremy hesitated. Everything in him screamed to turn back, to leave, to get out of the building before it was too late. But how could he ignore those cries? What if there were kids trapped down there, scared and alone? He tightened his grip on the railing and began his descent. The steps were slick, the air even heavier here. Smoke curled up from the lower floors, and the faint smell of burning wood mixed with something else. Something he couldn't quite place. He reached the landing of the second floor, and that's when he saw her. A woman, old and frail, standing in the middle of the hallway. Her back was to him, her thin, white hair falling in tangled strands down her back. She wore a hospital gown that hung loosely on her bony frame. Jeremy froze, his hand tightening on the railing. "Ma'am?" he said softly. The woman didn't move. She stood there, unnervingly still, as if she hadn't heard him. "Are you okay?" He tried again, his voice louder this time. Slowly, she turned her head, not her body, just her head, and looked at him over her shoulder. Her eyes were empty, hollow pits that seemed to swallow the dim light around her. Jeremy stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. The woman's mouth twitched, curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes, or whatever was left of them. She took a step toward him, her movements jerky, unnatural. Jeremy's breath caught in his throat as the crying suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening, like the building itself was holding its breath. And then she spoke, her voice raspy and broken, like glass scraping against metal. "You shouldn't be here." Jeremy's heart was hammering in his chest. The woman's words echoed in his head, low, rasping, and unnatural. "You shouldn't be here." He took a step back, gripping the stairwell railing so hard his knuckles turned white. She wasn't moving anymore, but her hollow eyes stayed locked on him, as though she could see straight through his skin, right into the trembling core of him. The hallway stretched out behind her, dark and endless, and Jeremy felt the weight of it. The suffocating sense that there was something down there, something worse than this woman. But her presence rooted him in place, like stepping closer to her would somehow wake the nightmare even further. He swallowed hard and forced the words out. I'm just trying to leave. Do you know where the exit is?" The woman tilted her head in a sharp, bird-like motion, her neck creaking as if it hadn't moved in decades. Then, impossibly, she smiled wider, her teeth, jagged, uneven, and far too many of them, caught the faint light from the flickering bulb above. "No one leaves," she croaked, the words as sharp as razors. "Not anymore." Jeremy's instincts screamed at him to run, but before he could move, the crying started again. Louder this time, more desperate. It was coming from behind her, deeper into the hallway. He couldn't understand how it was possible. It sounded like dozens of children, their voices overlapping in a chorus of misery. It made his skin crawl, every hair on his body standing on end. The woman took a step toward him, and her feet dragged across the floor with a sound like sandpaper against stone. He backed up further, the stairwell now at his side, his only escape. She stopped, as if sensing his hesitation, and then spoke again. "They're waiting for you." "What are you talking about?" His voice cracked, a sharp edge of panic cutting through it. He didn't want to know the answer, but he couldn't stop himself from asking. Her hollow gaze didn't waver. "You heard them, didn't you? The little ones, they've been crying for so long, so long." Her voice faltered, breaking apart on the last word, like static on a dying radio. And then, without warning, she turned and began to shuffle down the hallway, heading toward the source of the cries. Jeremy stood frozen, every nerve in his body at war. He could feel the oppressive heat of the fire closing in from somewhere above him. The air was growing heavier, more suffocating. He could smell the burning wood and melting plastic, feel the faint vibration of the building groaning under its own weight. But then there were the cries. Those cries. Against every rational thought, Jeremy found himself stepping forward, following the woman. His bare feet felt like lead against the cold tile. Every step an effort to push past the screaming alarm bells in his brain. He kept his distance, though. He wasn't stupid. The woman was too unnatural, too wrong. But he couldn't leave those children. He couldn't leave them behind. The hallway seemed to stretch forever, the smoke thicker here, curling around him like unseen hands. The cries grew louder, almost deafening now, but there was something strange about them. They didn't sound right. At first, he couldn't put his finger on it, but the longer he listened, the more it gnawed at him. There was no pause between the cries, no hiccup of breath, no variation in tone. It was like a loop, a recording stuck on repeat. His chest tightened with dread. He wanted to stop, to turn back and take his chances with the fire, but the woman was ahead of him, her figure a pale silhouette in the thickening smoke. She stopped in front of a door, room 214. The number was barely visible, the metal scorched black around the edges. Jeremy could see her reaching for the handle, her bony fingers trembling as they closed around it. She looked over her shoulder at him one last time, her smile fading into something darker. "Don't let them in," she whispered, and then she opened the door. What happened next was chaos. The cries erupted into something far worse, a high-pitched, inhuman wail that made Jeremy slap his hands over his ears. The sound wasn't just loud, it was piercing, vibrating through his skull like nails being driven into his brain. He stumbled backward, his vision swimming as the smoke seemed to swirl into the room, pulled toward whatever was inside. For a brief second, Jeremy saw them. Small figures, their shapes barely human, twisted and warped. Their eyes glowed faintly, not with innocence, but with something dark, something ancient. They moved unnaturally, their limbs jerking like puppets on tangled strings. And their faces, God, their faces, were hollow, empty voids where mouths and eyes should have been. Jeremy screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the wailing. He turned and ran, his legs screaming in protest as he bolted back toward the stairwell. Behind him, he could hear them, those things, scrambling out of the room, their tiny feet slapping against the tile, chasing him. He burst into the stairwell and slammed the door shut behind him, his chest heaving as he threw his weight against it. But it didn't stop the sound. Their cries, Their wails seeped through the cracks, wrapping around him like a living thing. He looked up the stairs, knowing he had to keep moving, knowing the fire was somewhere above him. But the thought of going back down, back to where those things were, was impossible. Jeremy stumbled up the steps, the smoke thicker now, each breath burning his lungs. The heat was unbearable, and the walls felt like they were closing in. He could hear the building groaning, the distant sound of flames consuming everything in their path. But worse than that, worse than the fire, was the faint sound of the children's laughter. It wasn't coming from below anymore. It was above him. Jeremy froze on the stairs, his breath hitching. The laughter wasn't faint anymore. It was clear, echoing down the smoke-filled stairwell like a sinister melody. It wasn't the innocent giggle of children playing. It was distorted, unnatural, layered with something cruel and mocking. His legs felt like jelly, but he knew he had no choice. The fire was closing in, the heat unbearable. He had to keep moving. The laughter grew louder with each step, the smoke swirling around him like a living thing. Jeremy's mind raced. Were they already up here, waiting for him? Or worse, were they leading him somewhere? He thought about turning back, but he remembered the door, the hollow faces, the way those things had scrambled toward him. No, he couldn't go back. He pushed himself up the final flight of stairs, his lungs screaming for air. When he reached the top, the door to the rooftop was ajar, creaking softly as the wind pushed against it. For a brief, fleeting moment, he felt hope. If he could just get to the roof, maybe someone would see him. Maybe there was still time for rescue. But as he stepped closer, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The laughter. It wasn't just coming from behind him anymore. It was coming from the other side of the door, too. Jeremy hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. His instincts screamed at him to turn around, to find another way. But there was no other way. The fire roared below, and the smoke was choking him. He had no choice. He pushed the door open. The rooftop was bathed in an eerie orange glow from the raging fire below. The air was heavy with ash and embers, swirling in the wind like snowflakes from hell. But that wasn't what made Jeremy's knees buckle. They were there. The children. Dozens of them. They stood in a loose circle in the middle of the roof, their tiny, warped bodies silhouetted against the fiery backdrop. Their hollow faces turned toward him in unison, as if they'd been waiting for him. The laughter stopped, replaced by an unbearable silence. Jeremy stumbled backward, his legs tangling beneath him. He hit the ground hard, the rough surface scraping his palms. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice cracking. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stopped just a few feet away, tilting its head like it was studying him. Then, in a voice that was eerily childlike, yet layered with something ancient, it whispered, "You left us." Jeremy's stomach dropped. What? What are you talking about? I don't even know you." The figure tilted its head further, the empty void where its eyes should have been, seeming to stare straight into him. "You forgot. They all forget." The words hit Jeremy like a sledgehammer. Memories, fragmented and disjointed, began to surface. The fire, the screams, the hospital filled with chaos and panic, and the children, patients he had seen in passing, their faces filled with fear as the staff rushed to evacuate the building. He had been one of the staff, a nurse. He had left them behind. "No," Jeremy whispered, shaking his head. "No, that's not true. I couldn't have. I didn't." But the memories were there, sharp and undeniable. He had abandoned them. The circle of children began to close in, their movements unnatural, their limbs bending in ways that defied logic. Jeremy scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. "I didn't mean to," he shouted. "I swear, I didn't mean to." The laughter started again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the children. It was coming from behind him. He spun around and saw her, the old woman. She stood at the edge of the roof, her hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "It doesn't matter what you meant," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "They only care what you did." Jeremy backed away, the children closing in on one side, the woman blocking his only escape. The fire roared louder beneath them, the heat rising in waves. "Please," he begged, his voice breaking. I didn't know this would happen." The woman's smile stretched impossibly wide, her jagged teeth glinting in the firelight. "It's not about what happens to you," she said. "It's about what happens to them." Before Jeremy could respond, the roof beneath him groaned, the sound of cracking concrete splitting the air. He looked down and saw the edges beginning to crumble, the fire licking hungrily at the structure. The children stopped moving, their heads tilting upward in unison. The woman's laughter grew louder, echoing in his ears as the ground beneath him gave way. Jeremy screamed as he fell, the fiery abyss swallowing him whole. The last thing he heard was the children's laughter blending with the woman's voice as it whispered, "No one leaves." Then there was nothing. Click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Mortifacts for more real and true stories like this.